This series of talks relates to the promises that God has made in the Bible. There are different kinds of promises. There are big promises, little promises. There's false promises. There's conditional promises. But when we come to the Bible, we find that the promises that God has made are not something that's airy-fairy, but something which is positive and substantial. This series will deal with the promises that God made to the fathers of Israel. It deals with the concepts relating to whether or not we can trust God for what He says. So I'd ask you in this series to take a pencil and paper, to write down the quotations one after another, examine them for yourself, and see whether or not what I have to say is in accordance with what the Bible has to say. If you're not aware of who Abraham was, he was a man who lived about 3,500 years ago, I should say, in the land of the Chaldeans, or what we'd call Mesopotamia. He was called by God to go into a land that God would show him in due course. He journeyed from Ur of the Chaldees and finally came to rest in the land that we call today Israel. He lived in the hill country of Palestine or Israel, and God spake to him on one occasion, and this is recorded in the 13th chapter of the book of Genesis. And in that, God takes him onto a high mountain, or into the mountain region of Judea. And he says to him, I want you to look northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give it to thee and to thy seed forever. Further on in the chapter, he elucidates a little more by defining the land, which he says will be from the river Nile unto the great river Euphrates. Now go back and have a look at these verses and note what they say. He was in Israel, or Palestine. He was told to look north, south, east, and west. The only direction he was not told to look was upward. He was told that his seed would inherit the land forever. But note very carefully that it also says that this land would be given to Abraham forever. So there's a promise that God made to Abraham. It is told in later chapters, in the 15th chapter, that Abraham began to worry because he had no children. How therefore can the promise that was made in the 13th chapter be realized when he doesn't have any children? But God said, I'll make a promise to you that will assure that. You will have a seed, he says, as many or as innumerable as the stars in the heavens, if you can count them. And then Abraham believed God, and that was counted to him for righteousness. On that subject, we'll deal with that point about faith being counted for righteousness at another time. But God, wishing to show to Abraham just how sure that promise was, makes a covenant with Abraham. The details of this are found in the 15th chapter, where God tells Abraham to take certain animals, divide them, put them down in a row, and to walk up and down between the pieces thereof. And then God says he then made a covenant with Abraham. And the covenant was that the land that he had promised to him would be given to him for an everlasting possession. So God made the promise. That's number one. He confirmed that promise by making a covenant. Now, in olden times, making a covenant was like signing a document whereby you agree to certain conditions. And we would today say, if we were buying land, for argument's sake, sometimes there's a covenant on the land, which means there are certain conditions that you must abide by before you're allowed to build on that property. So a covenant's made between two people. In our day, we draw up a document, we shake hands, it's signed, stamped, and that's an agreement. In those days, it was done by the slaying of animals, the two parties walking up and down between the pieces. Then once that was done, then the terms of the covenant were stated, and that was a surety that it would be done. So we have in this particular occasion God making promises to Abraham and confirming those promises by making a solemn covenant, which means that the promise cannot be broken. So the promise to Abraham was that his seed and he would inherit all the land. And he then defines the area of the land as being the land of Canaan, inhabited then by the 7 nations that inhabited Canaan. In our next session, we'll deal with the way in which God made another promise to Abraham.